Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, but if it were to be held tomorrow. Normally when I make an election prediction, I attempt to interpret the trends and expect what's going to happen in November, but today we'll be throwing all that out the window and talking about what would happen if the election were to be held tomorrow. With that said, we're going to get right into it here, and what you're going to notice is that once we fill out the safe and likely states, not much is going to change. Only a few states are going to really be different here. And especially for the safe states, that's because states that I expect to be safe for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in November are likely still safe for him or for them right now. So Kamala Harris is going to start out with 191 electoral votes. Trump's going to start out just below her with 122. And then once we get into our likely states, you're going to see I'm going to exclude a couple here. I think Kamala Harris is going to get up to 213 electoral votes, while Trump should be up to 219. So Trump's going to take a slight lead. Now, what you're going to see here is that I'm going to give Texas to Donald Trump, as well as Florida. Florida is already in the likely column, but Texas I have for the November election as a lean Trump state. Right now, it's more favorable to him. My assumption or my logic for predicting Texas to be around a 5-point victory instead of maybe a 6 or 7-point victory for Trump in November is that Democrats will be energized in November, and they will turn out, their voters in deep blue parts of the state, while also continuing the trends that are favorable to them in the suburbs. If the election were to happen right now, not a guarantee, but I think we might see slightly lower Democratic turnout because they haven't mobilized all their voters yet, and we would also likely see potentially, maybe undecided voters in the suburbs not coming home for Kamala Harris the way they would in a November election. Now, with this, we kind of have our battleground map, and you'll notice that Virginia is also here. That doesn't mean that I think it would be super competitive even if it were held tomorrow, but we do know that if we take a look at the polling in this state, we have gotten one poll recently in the post-dropout era, and it only shows Kamala Harris up by 3. She's at 47%, Trump's at 44%. So we know that in the one poll we have, the race is, pretty close. In this case, it's within the margin of error. And I don't really think Virginia's competitive in November, but it's not really a good look for Kamala Harris that she's only at 47% in a state that Biden got 54% in. Again, I don't think she'll lose it, but that goes to show me she does have a bit of base consolidation left to do. But also, this isn't an amazing pollster, so, wouldn't put too much stock into it. That being said, I think more favorably to her, she would win Michigan, and she'd win Arizona. Now, I'm giving her these two states for a very simple reason. Democrats have energy right now. We're in the middle of the Democratic National Convention, and typically, as I'm sure many of you know, we usually see candidates get a bit of a boost in the aftermath of their convention. It's kind of called the convention bump, and it occurs in politics. And the only time we really didn't see a convention bump was for the Democrats in 2020, which was odd. But again, Joe Biden was already ahead by so much nationwide that he didn't really need a convention bump. This year, Kamala Harris could really use a convention bump just because the national polls are relatively close. And so she'll likely get one because it is a real convention. This time in 2020, Democrats didn't really have a real convention. So keep that in mind. And again, in terms of energy momentum, I think Kamala Harris broadly just has the bit of an advantage right now. Again, nationally, she's up by 2.9%. And that's actually up from last week. If we go to this time last week, August 14th, she was up by 2.6. So she's risen by about 0.3%, which, obviously is pretty good for her. But it's not too much of a movement. But, more importantly, in the past month, it's been a month since Joe Biden dropped out. She was in dead heat in, mid to late July. So keep that in mind and just remember that the momentum right now is with Kamala Harris. I'm not saying it'll stay there in November, but right now that's enough to, I think, give her a boost in these states, especially because, again, in Michigan, in Arizona, Republicans haven't won a race federally since 2016. That could be a problem for them, especially in Arizona, because they've had, in Arizona, every year, I feel horrible for these people because they always have to deal with these Senate races. Every year we've had a Senate race in Arizona. 2016, McCain versus Kirkpatrick. 2018, McSally versus Sinema. 2020, McSally lost twice in a row. Mark Kelly that time. 2022, it was Kelly versus Masters. And now we have a non-special election finally where it's Kari Lake versus Blake Masters. So Republicans have had plenty of chances to win a Senate race here, and they haven't been able to do it since 2016. And Trump, by the way, lost state in 2020. So both these states, energy there, I think, is for Democrats. Now, on the contrary, I believe in Georgia, Donald Trump has the momentum. Now, that doesn't mean that Kamala Harris can't come back and win it. Democrats have been down in the polls here many times before and come back to win it in the past few years. But right now, he's up by a point, and Kamala Harris is only at 45.6% of the vote, which is nowhere near which needs to be to win the state. Latest polling, all very good for Trump. We actually have some, higher quality polls here, like New York Times, Siena, and their likely voter screen when they push undecideds. Trump is up by 4. I think that's the best estimate. I think he'd win by closer to 2 if the election were to be held today, but still an advantage for him. Although this could be kind of like a reverse version of another state where maybe Harris gets better before November, but perhaps in Arizona she gets worse, or maybe in Michigan she gets worse. So keep that in mind. Now, North Carolina, right now, I don't think in November, but right now, I believe is more Democratic than Georgia. Doesn't mean that I think Kamala Harris would win there even if an election were to be held today, but it does mean that if you look at the polls, they clearly say a certain thing. And if you look at the average right now on 538, what's interesting is that it's a dead heat. Trump is up by less than 0.1%. It is exactly even. And we've actually seen a pretty significant shift towards Trump because he was up by a point. We didn't actually have a lot of polls if you go back to the beginning of August, but he was up by a point. In the latest polls, they've all had Kamala Harris winning this state. And this is a state that a lot of people kind of wrote off for Democrats. They said, look, if realistically Kamala Harris can outrun Joe Biden from 2020, but now good pollsters legitimately do show this as a blue-leaning state. You look at NYT Siena. Obviously, those of you who've been watching my channel recently know I've been pretty high on this pollster because they had an amazing 2022 track record. Let's look at their likely voter screen. The undecided push, Kamala Harris 49, Trump 47. So the polls do have it close. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because even though, why am I still saying Trump's going to win? Even though most polls have had Harris up in the past week, the polls in North Carolina have not been great for Democrats in recent years. 2016, dead heat, Hillary Clinton maybe narrowly ahead in some polls. Trump won the state by 3 points. In 2020, we saw Biden was up by just under 2% on election day. He lost it by around 1.3%. And then you look at the 2022 polls, which in that Senate race, in almost every competitive, in literally every competitive Senate race, the Democratic candidates were understated by the polls, right? John Fetterman wasn't ahead. Catherine Cortez Masto wasn't ahead. Raphael Warnock wasn't ahead. All three of them won. Mark Kelly was supposed to be in a toss-up race. He won by 5. And then in Wisconsin, even Wisconsin, they were historically polls have been very, very favorable, or the polling era has been very favorable to Republicans. In Wisconsin, we actually saw Democrats outperform their polls there. In North Carolina, Democrats beat their polls. Sherrod Beasley was down by 4, and she lost by 3. So she beat her polls, but not by nearly as much as any other Democrat running in a competitive Senate race did. The only Senate Democrat who did in a competitive race who did worse relative to their polls compared to Sherrod Beasley was Tim Ryan in Ohio. Beyond that, every other Senate Democrat in every other state outdid their polls. So North Carolina polling, not a lot of reasons to trust it. I get that it's been pretty good for Kamala Harris in the past week. We've seen this show before. Maybe it's closer than Georgia right now. I'm not sure it will be in November. And so I still have it read. I'll believe it when I see it. And conveniently now we have a pretty close election. 251 for Donald Trump, 252 for Kamala Harris. Pennsylvania, we're going to save for last because, again, if I give it to Kamala Harris, she wins. If I give it to Trump, he wins. So we're saving Pennsylvania for last. So we're now go to the state of Nevada. And again, Nevada, the polls here, kind of the opposite of North Carolina. In all but one recent election, they've actually overstated the Republican Party. 2016, Trump was winning here. 2018, Republicans were supposed to win the governorship in the Senate race. And then in 2020, they did overestimate Joe Biden by about 2%. But in 2022, Republicans were supposed to win the Senate race, and they lost it. Now, recent polling, it's been good for Kamala Harris. Focal data in their recent likely voter screen where they push undecideds, Harris is up by 5. NYT Siena did have Trump up, which I think is worth more because this is a better poll. There has been some movement towards Kamala Harris, right? Like she was, kind of tied even with Trump, and now she's up by but 0.1. But really, I mean, even then, it's kind of a bunch of noise, right? Because Trump was up by 1, now he's down by a little bit. So this is a state that I think could be very close, no matter what, and it will be very close. But again, Democrats do rely on kind of getting a firewall in Las Vegas and Clark County in the final weeks before the election with early voting. And obviously, if the election were held today, we'd kind of have to account for that. So we'd kind of be assuming they'd already be building up that infrastructure. But it's just the riskier pick to pick Kamala Harris to win Nevada. If it were held today, I think Trump would carry it, just because Democrats would need to really get out their voters. In Nevada specifically, that's a process that lasts for over 2 weeks. And right now, we don't really have any evidence they would do that yet because they don't need to. In November, maybe they will, but right now they don't need to. So now we're going to go back to Wisconsin. This is another important state. What you'll notice is that even if Trump does win Wisconsin, he doesn't win the election. He only gets 267. So Pennsylvania is what matters here. We're going to talk about Wisconsin first. And Wisconsin, the polls are good for Kamala Harris. Again, look at some of the better polls. Qantas, this is a GOP-aligned pollster. Kamala Harris up by 1. That's pretty good for her. We also take a look at some of the better polling here. New York Times Siena had her up by 4. Navigator, this is another GOP poll. It was tied. RMG had Harris up by 3. So Trump hasn't led a poll here. This actually was another screen. Trump hasn't really led a poll here, like on its own, since he led the Fox poll on July 24th against Kamala Harris. He was up by 1. So again, we haven't really gotten a good poll out of Wisconsin for Trump in like a month. So it's just easier to pick Kamala Harris to win this state. I don't think she'd win it by 3.3. Maybe she'd win it by 1. But right now, she's got the momentum here. Democrats have actually really focused on this state. They're outspending Republicans there right now. And I think actually Harris had a rally there on Tuesday night. So, I think the Democrats are really focusing on the state. So it's going to come down to Pennsylvania. And right now, we'll start with the polls. We'll kind of work our way from there. In Pennsylvania, it's a 1-point lead for Kamala Harris, down from about a 2-point lead last week. But again, the highest quality polling has not been good for Trump. And even in the GOP polls, Insider Advantage, this is a Republican poll. They only had Trump up by 1. In Rasmussen, this is a very Republican-aligned poll that actually I think got banned, right, from 538, which I don't think is fair. I think they should keep them there, even though they're not a very good poll. But anyways, Rasmussen had Trump down by 1. So they had actually found Harris lead there, which is interesting because Rasmussen was very high on Republicans in 2022, and they were very wrong in 2022. But we look at, again, just to kind of go back to Emerson, they had Trump up by 1, but Quinnipiac had Harris up by 3, and then we had NYT Siena had Harris up by 4. So the polling does favor Harris a little bit. I do maintain that she's going to need to really focus on the state more because actually, if you look at the past month, the Trump campaign has actually narrowly outspent the Harris campaign in Pennsylvania. The good news for the Harris campaign is that they do have more cash on hand, so going forward, that might not be the case, but that really helps Trump. With that being said, the polling clearly shows Harris has a slight advantage here. You also have to consider that, again, Donald Trump, to win, the Republicans have a very narrow path in Pennsylvania. It's doable. In 2016, Trump and Pat Toomey did it on the same day. But there's a reason they haven't won a federal election here since then. They haven't been able to do it. They need to really, really stop leading the Philadelphia suburbs. They need to really, really, just at that point, hope to get rural turnout up to 2020 levels. Because even in 2020, rural turnout was as high as it can get for Republicans. They still lost by around 80,000 votes statewide. So they need kind of to improve in Democratic areas and also get their turnout up sky high like it was in 2020. No margin for error. I think the Harris path is a bit easier. Not saying that she's a favorite to win the state in November, but if the election were to be held today, I'd have to give Pennsylvania to her. So 281 electoral votes for Kamala Harris, 257 for Donald Trump. If it were to be held, today or tomorrow. Again, this is not my official prediction for November, but this is where we are at this point in time based on the polls, the momentum for each candidate. So let me know what you think is going to happen between now and November. Let me know who you think would win if it were held tomorrow. And tell me who you think would win if it were held in November. Do we think it's going to get better for Trump? Do we think it's going to get better for Harris? We'll talk about that a lot next 2 months, which is why you should subscribe. Again, this channel has been growing a lot recently. I really appreciate all the support we've been getting. It really means a lot to me. So if you're not subscribed, I've checked my analytics. The majority of people who have been watching my videos recently have not been subscribed. So just click the button if you have not done so already. It really does help me out. Leave a like. And again, you're always free to suggest videos to me for next time. So with that being said, I'll see you all in the next one.